good to see you guys today. Let me also welcome those who are watching today online. Great to have you guys with us. I like to say that whether you're a first-time guest, a long-time member, or somewhere in between, welcome. We're just glad that you're here. If you have a Bible with you, open it up or turn it on. Go to the book of Numbers. That's not difficult to find. It's in the first part of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and then you have the book of Numbers. Find Numbers chapter 13, and we're going to look at the whole chapter today. I'm going to read it. We're going to try to unpack it. And then we're going to look at a handful of verses in chapter 14. Then also find your message notes, and let's get started. So just a show of hands, at least from those of you who are willing to participate. How many of you have seen the movie The Wizard of Oz? Even the guys. Yeah, because I know it comes across as a girls' movie. Sorry, girls, but it sort of does. You know, I'm old enough to remember that when a movie like The Wizard of Oz came on, it came on once a year. So some of you are not old enough to remember life before DVDs, but I could remember life before VHS and before Beta. It's going back there, right? I remember when a VCR would cost about $800, and I think you can find those occasionally for like $25. You can buy them for almost nothing at a secondhand store. But you know, back in the day, movie theaters during the summer might re-release a movie like The Wizard of Oz, but you know, mostly as a kid, you look for it to come on once a year. And every kid knew when it was coming on because it would, you know, sort of go around the school. And if you didn't watch it on that Sunday night, it'd be a whole calendar year probably before you got to see it again. Well, for those of you who haven't seen it, and for those of you who are getting a little older, let me just open up this file in your mind. The Wizard of Oz is about a girl named Dorothy who is swept away from her home in Kansas by a tornado, and she is dropped into this magical land of Oz, not to be confused with the Band of Oz. Now, to get back home, she has to follow the yellow brick road, and that's supposed to lead her to the Emerald City, where she hopes to find the wizard who she believes can get her back home. And then, of course, along the way, she meets a few new friends, a scarecrow who's looking for a brain, a tin man who wants a heart, and a cowardly lion who wants courage. Now, just as a side note here, the book, and don't you hate it when people say, well, the book is a lot better than the movie? I wouldn't say the book is better than the movie, but it's darker than the movie. And it explains to you why there are some of these issues and why the scarecrow wants a brain and why the tin man is tin and he's looking for a heart and why this lion has lost its courage. It's kind of interesting. Well, in their journey to the Emerald City, they face some pretty big challenges like flying monkeys, dark forests that are full of danger, and of course, some witches. But in the end, here's what they discover. It's very powerful. They discover that what they're looking for, what they've been trying to find, is already inside of them. That they already have what they needed. They just needed to believe on it and act on it. Now, this is not exactly like the children of Israel, but it's a lot like the children of Israel when we meet them in Numbers 13. They've come to the edge of the promised land. They've been through a tremendous journey. They've gone through deserts. They've experienced God's great miracles. But then when they see about or hear about giants in the land that they're about to take over, fear takes over instead. And so like the cowardly lion, they feel like they're not enough. And the scary part is they begin to think that their God isn't enough. And they stalled out. And it cost them so much. Today we're going to walk through this moment in Israel's journey, and we're going to discover that faith isn't about bravery at all. It's about trusting in the one who's already made a way, the one who already has a plan, the one who already has a purpose and a path. And we're going to see the importance of seeing through eyes of faith rather than eyes of fear. This is one of my favorite stories. You know, I think one of the things that you should do as a church in the summertime in particular is look at the epic stories in the Bible. You know, the big stories. And the story of the children being released from Egyptian captivity and going into the promised land, their 40 years of wandering through the desert. It's hard to just bring that all into one message or even in one summer, and I'm not going to try to do that today, but this is such a big part of a really big story. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible, especially these epic stories. And I hope that you'll open up to it. Not just to hear what I have to say, but I think God wants to speak to us. I'll just tell you, and I may say something about this at the end. I think God is using this story to do some work on me, and I hope that you'll give him room to do some work on you. So before we get into Numbers 13, let me give you a little bit of background information on it that I think you need to know. So the book of Numbers gets its name from a census that was taken in the first few chapters. And the purpose of the census was just to organize the people to travel, to guard the tabernacle, and even to fight because they're in a really dangerous place. God was giving them this land, but they had to go in and take it. Moses had led the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery, and this was no small thing. And then they've passed through the Red Sea on their way to the Promised Land. And by the way, it's called the Promised Land because God promised to make Abraham the father of a great family that would become a great nation that would need land. And that was the land of Canaan. So God promised Abraham and his descendants the land. Thus, it's called the Promised Land. Still with me? Yes. So Moses and the people have been out in the desert now for about 2 years. They're at the edge of the Promised Land, literally where they could walk into it. They're camped at a place called Kadesh. Say Kadesh. And God said, okay, it's time for you to go in and take the land. And here's what you do. You send in some spies to check it out. So they selected these spies who went into Canaan. And then they returned to Camp Kadesh with their reports. And here's the deal. 10 of them had negative reports. Only 2 of them had positive reports. Now, I want you to listen carefully, okay? The 10 spies who brought back negative reports saw through eyes of fear. That's important. The other 2 spies saw through eyes of faith. And I would tell you that the 2 spies that were looking through eyes of faith or even looking beyond the land. Certainly they're looking beyond the obstacles. They're looking at the fact that God promised them this land. So the 10 spies that had negative reports, they saw only the obstacles. But then the 2 spies with the positive reports, they saw the opportunities. See, this is about perspective. It's about how you see things. Now, you need to know that the story has, at least for this generation, it has a tragic ending. And it ends tragically because the majority of the leaders, and these spies were leaders. There was a leader from each of the tribes. We'll get into that in a minute. It's because they had the wrong perspective, and they caused the children of Israel to stall in the desert and not go in and take the land that God had promised them. Those 10 leaders caused hundreds and thousands of people to spend the rest of their lives wandering through a desert, a place that was about the size of Myrtle Beach, until they died. Because they had no faith. I mean, think about that. The decisions of 10 people impacted an entire generation of people. And that's the importance of leadership. In fact, John Maxwell says that everything rises and falls on leadership. Leadership is important. Leadership matters. It matters in your home. It matters in your church. It matters in your community. It matters on school councils. It matters at every level of society. Okay, let's get into Numbers 13. Still with me? Numbers 13, verse 1. The Lord now said to Moses, "Send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land that I'm giving the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes." So Moses did as the Lord commanded. He sent out 12 men, all tribal leaders of Israel, from their camp in the wilderness of Paran, again named Kadesh. And these were the tribes and the names of their leaders. So Israel is made up of these 12 different tribes. They're all the sons of Jacob. You can read all about it in Genesis 25 through 50. Now, I'm not going to read the name of each tribe. I'm just going to give you the tribe that the leaders came from. There's Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Issachar, Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Manasseh, who was the son of Joseph, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, and Gad. These are the names of the men that Moses sent out to explore the land. Moses called Hoshea, in most translations of the Bible, this is the New Living Translation, there's a set of parentheses that gives this explanation. Moses called Hoshea, son of Nun, by the name of Joshua. So the name Hoshea means deliverer. So think about it. Every time someone called out Hoshea's name, they're saying, "Hey, deliverer, how you doing? Good to see you." Back then, names had meaning. But then Moses changed his name to Joshua, which means God delivers, or Jehovah God delivers. God is salvation. Now, Joshua becomes a very important leader for the people. He becomes a great military leader. He becomes Moses' assistant. Later, he becomes Moses' successor, who will finally lead the Israelites into the promised land. But this new name is important for him and for future generations of Israelites. Because listen, it was a reminder that Hoshea doesn't deliver. With his new name, Joshua, it means that God delivers. So it wasn't just Joshua who was this, again, a really great military leader. It's not just that he's fighting for the people, but God is fighting for the people. God is the deliverer. God is salvation. See, these details, they matter. Verse 17. Moses gave the men these instructions and sent them out to explore the land. He said, "Go north through the Negev into the hill country. See what the land is like and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many." Go in and check this place out. And that's just a smart thing to do, right? Is it good? Is it bad? Do their towns have walls? Are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? You know, these are important things when you're going to try to build a culture out in it. Do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see. And then again, we have this note from the author of Numbers. It happened to be the season for harvesting the first ripe grapes. It comes into play here shortly. So they went up and explored the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob near Labo Hamath. Going north, they passed through the Negev and arrived at Hebron, where Hamim, Sheshai, and by the way, if I was mispronouncing these names, would you know? Nope. So listen, that's a secret there. You just say them like you got it. And most of the time, people won't really know. But here's why he's listing these out. They're all descendants of Anak. The ancient town of Hebron was founded 7 years before the Egyptian city of Zoan. So look, he's given historical details here. When they came to the valley of Eshcol, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, so large it took 2 of them to carry it on a pole between them. They also brought back samples of the pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol, which means cluster. And you can understand why, right? And it was named so because of the cluster of grapes the Israelite men cut there. And this is where the story changes. It transitions. And this is important. This is when the spies return with their reports. After exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land, which had to be impressive, right? This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country. A land flowing with milk and honey, not cow's milk and not bee honey, sheep's milk and date honey. So a little bit different. Here's the kind of fruit it produces. And the people had to be really excited. And then there's this but in verse 28. But the people living there are powerful and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the crowd, the people, as they stood before Moses. So just imagine, they're excited over this great report, but now they're hearing about these fortified cities and names like the Moabites, Jebusites, Hittites. These are strong tribal people. They had a reputation of doing terrible, horrible things to other people. They did things to people in war that I don't really even want to talk about in mixed company. So the people go from this high to this great low. I would imagine that the murmur has turned into this, hey, let's just forget it and stay here in the desert sort of conversation. But Caleb, one of the spies that had a good report, he tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once and take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They're stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who tries to go and live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. Here's the point of the story that I want you to grab hold of today. The spies of Israel let fear stop them from doing what God wanted them to do. Fear. It was fear that kept them out of the blessings and favor of God. It was fear that kept them from doing something significant with their lives. It was fear that kept them from living out the purpose and plan that God had for them. They saw life and what God was challenging them to do through eyes of fear rather than eyes of faith. Let me show you two things that fear produces in our lives. I want you to write these into your notes. The first one is we underestimate what God can do. We underestimate what God can do. Look back in Numbers 13:28. The spies report, but the people living there are powerful and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. So think about this. The children of Israel and some of their leaders had forgotten that just 2 years ago they were slaves of the most dominant nation on earth at the time. And in fact, if you just look at all recorded or all known nations in history, they're one of the great cultures, one of the great warring cultures of the world, the Egyptians. And certainly at their time, they were the superpower. But God, without even raising up an army, forced the Pharaoh, who had the world's most powerful army, to set his people free. Now here they are only about 2 years later, and the children of Israel are worried about local tribes. Have you ever noticed that the longer you look at a problem, the larger it grows? This is how molehills become mountains. You know, it's interesting that about 40 years later, when God finally allowed Joshua to lead the next generation into the promised land, a local girl there named Rahab said, you know, for the last 40 years, we've been living here in fear of you. Why? Because we heard about the great miracles of Israel's God. We've been just waiting on the day you would attack us for 40 years. They were afraid for no reason, stuck for no reason. Here's the second thing fear produces in our lives. We underestimate what we can do. Now, don't hear me wrong. It's all about what God can do. But God uses people. He uses us. Verse 33, in verse 33, the spies said, we even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. It'd be interesting to find out how they knew that that's what the giants were thinking. Talk about a low self-image. They said, we're like little insects. We've already been eaten up. And even though they were not literally eaten up, they may as well have been. They're thinking, we can never do this. It's just too big of a project. Let me tell you something. And your pastor is an example of this. God doesn't use people based on their abilities. He uses people based on their availability. Here's sort of the big picture lesson that I hope you'll get today. Problems don't defeat you. Your perspective on your problems, that's what defeats you. It's how you look at your problems. It's how you think about your problems. I mean, like the problem that you're facing right now, regardless of what it is, the problem is not the problem. The real problem is the way you see your problem. Israel was defeated because of their negative, unbelieving attitude. So whenever you have this negative, unbelieving attitude, or you're seeing all the obstacles rather than the opportunities of something God has called you to do, remember what Jesus says in Matthew 19:26. With men, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. They missed it. Let me give you 3 things that happen when people look at life, their situation, their calling, whatever it is, when they look at it through eyes of fear rather than eyes of faith. Number 1, I become discouraged. I become discouraged. Numbers 14:1 says, the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. And listen, this is not just a few tens of people. We're talking about people in the thousands, perhaps the hundreds of thousands. And the result of seeing their problem through eyes of fear is that they became discouraged. Their worst fears overtook them. They got caught up in the negative emotions of the moment. And listen, they got caught up in the negative emotions of their own moment and the negative emotions of the people all around them. Let me give you some advice here, just as a leader, as a church planter, as someone who's been involved in startup things before. Be careful who you tell about your plans at first. Be careful who you tell your dream to. Be careful who you trust that with, because not everybody can handle that. There are a lot of God-given dreams and ministries that never get off the ground because the one who received the dream, the one who received the vision, the one who received the calling told the wrong people too soon. You need to start by telling people who have a bigger perspective on things, people who can see what the opportunities would be, not the people who only see the obstacles at first. Now listen, at some point you have to deal with the obstacles. And so at some point you need those people who can say, listen, I know you're thinking about this, but here are other things you have to think about. How much does it cost? How many people does it take? You know, those sorts of things. But if you tell those people too soon, they'll squash it before it ever even gets started. You get discouraged. And then you just absorb the thinking around you. You know, the other thing I would say is be careful who you surround yourself with. I mean, it's not like there were a handful of crybabies in this crowd. It was full of crybabies. And if you hang out with crybabies all the time, guess what you become pretty soon? People are like soybeans. You know why soybeans make a good filler in foods? It's because soybeans don't have their own taste. They absorb the taste around them. So if you mix, soybeans in with hamburger, the soybeans absorb the flavor of the hamburger. And you absorb the flavor of the people that are around you. Be careful. Here's the second thing that happens. I become discontent. The Bible says in Numbers 14:2, their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. So first the people mourned, and then they started complaining. And these people specialized in complaining. I mean, they're good at it. At one point, they were so unhappy with Moses that they were going to stone him to death. And listen, they would have stoned him to death if God had not stopped them. So think about that. It seems crazy, doesn't it? It's certainly hysterical. Moses is one of the greatest leaders in history, not just the greatest leaders in the Bible, but one of the greatest leaders in history. And they complained to him or about him from the time they left Egypt until the day he died. Over the years, I've learned that people who feel like failures usually become great critics. Great in the sense that they're large critics or largely critical, and great in the sense that they're really good at it. See, people who don't feel good about themselves like to complain about those who do. People who they don't feel like they've done enough with their life will complain and do what they can to discourage other people who are trying to do something with their lives. You know, one of the things I was thinking about recently with our students coming back from camp, thinking about, as a church, we need to encourage what they experienced. Because I remember years ago when I was a pastor, but I worked with another organization during the summer to help them do summer camps, and I was the camp pastor there for about 4 weeks out of the summer for 3 or 4 different seasons. And one of the discouraging things was that these kids would come there and they would have an experience that was a life-changing thing. And in fact, I'll just tell you, you would be shocked to know how many pastors, worship leaders, missionaries, when they give their testimony, their lives were changed at summer camp. That's where God called them, or they first heard God's calling on their lives. But these kids would come, they would have an amazing experience. And we knew that we were sending them back to churches that when they got there, excited about their faith, those churches were going to say, hey, calm down, just relax a little bit. You went to summer camp, you got all pumped up about Jesus. Welcome home. Welcome to the real world. And around here, we don't get that excited about Jesus. When the Israelites had the chance, this opportunity to do what God called them to do, and they didn't do it. They started blaming their leaders. They blamed everyone but themselves. Listen, some of you who sit on the sidelines and you critique, whether it's something with church or something maybe it's with students, maybe you're just at an age in your life when you're pretty sure that there were some opportunities you didn't take when you were younger that you just can't take now. You feel bad about that? Well, instead of sitting on that, why don't you encourage some people around you to take advantage of opportunities that you didn't take advantage of? Be a cheerleader. Be an encourager. And then here's number 3. Eventually, I'll just quit. Fear will make you want to quit. Look at Numbers 14:3. The people said, like this chorus, "Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder." And this is the line that gets me. "Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt?" Imagine that. Let's just go back to the good old days when we were slaves in Egypt. It's just so typical. They're lamenting a time when they were slaves and their ancestors were slaves for 400 years. The problem is they preferred slavery to safety. They'd rather live as slaves emotionally, relationally, and spiritually than risk freedom. They'd rather go back to Egypt to be slaves than to take the risk of putting their faith and trust in God, the God who has done nothing for them but keep his promises. And again, the tragic thing is that these people lost their momentum and died in the desert when all they needed to do was just have a different perspective. But instead of seeing through eyes of faith, they chose fear. I'm going to close with this. When you were born, you were born, all things being normal. You were born with your five senses, the ability to hear, taste, touch, smell, sight. And everything you experience in life comes through these senses. So when you're born physically, you have physical senses. But when you're born spiritually, you're given spiritual senses. Spiritual eyes, spiritual ears, etc. Those of us who are born again Christians have to stop pretending like the only reality is what we can see and experience through our physical senses. Because we live in a world that is every bit as much spiritual as it is physical. And so you have to have spiritual eyes to see what God is doing in the world. If you're going to do anything great for God, you have to see things the way God sees them. And this has to do with every area of your life, including the area where you need a miracle. All through the scriptures, God is trying to get people to see with spiritual eyes. And one of those moments comes in Genesis 13, verses 14 through 17. You have it in your notes. God took Abraham up on a hill and said to him, "Look as far as you can see in every direction, north and south, east and west. I'm giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. And I'll give you so many descendants that, like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted." He said, "Go and walk through the land in every direction, for I'm giving it to you." He tells Abraham to take a victory lap in land he doesn't have yet. And it's not just that he doesn't have an offer on the land. He doesn't have a contract on the land. He doesn't have kids of his own. But he believed God because he saw through spiritual eyes. And the disappointing thing is that here at Camp Kadesh, here are his children. Here are great-great-great-granddaddy Abraham's large family. But they didn't have Abraham's spiritual eyes. They didn't have his faith. I can't tell you exactly why I'm teaching this message today. I can only tell you that I think God is doing things in the world. He's at work in the world. I feel like he's at work in my life. I feel like he's at work in the lives of my family members. I feel like in some ways he's preparing us for what's next. But I'm not sure what next is. But I want to see through spiritual eyes, through his eyes. And I'll tell you what I know for sure. At some point, every person, every church comes to its own Camp Kadesh. You know, a place where the stakes are high, the risks are great, and you can either move forward in faith or because of fear, you can settle for comfort, a place of safety and mediocrity, and die there. I believe God wants more for you. I believe He wants more for me, more for our church. Let's pray together. In fact, if you would, just stand with me. Once you're standing, if you'll just bow your head and close your eyes. Heavenly Father, as much as it's possible, with as much room as we'll give you. I'm not trying to say that we can limit you. You can do whatever you want. But as much as we'll give you the freedom in our lives, help us to have your eyes, your spiritual eyes, to see what you're doing in the world around us and in our lives. Help us to have faith eyes, not fear eyes. Faith eyes so that we can respond to what you're calling us to, so that we can get our mind and our lives around your calling and what you want to do. I pray, Lord, in the very best way, not in a hurtful way, but in the very best way, I pray that you would unsettle us this morning. Where we walk out today knowing that we're called for more, to do more, to be more, to take new ground, to do new things, take on new ministries, or